Only a little over a month before President Lincoln was shot and killed at Ford's Theater, he gave a speech on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. This speech was his second inaugural address, and according to some scholars, this was Lincoln's greatest speech. My name is Dr. Rick Gardiner from Columbus State University. This is another Muskogee County School District podcast, Lincoln's second inaugural address. It was 1865. The Civil War had been going on for 4 years. Over 500,000 Americans had lost their lives. President Lincoln had just been reelected for the second time. On the day that he was sworn in, Lincoln gave this speech on the steps of the Capitol building.
On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it, and the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invoke his aid against the other. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
This was an emotional speech. In this speech, Lincoln made 3 main points. One of the points he emphasized was something that he had not made abundantly clear before, but at this point he felt it was time. The cause of the Civil War, said Lincoln, was slavery. You see, in 1861, Lincoln said that slavery wasn't the issue. The issue back then, according to Lincoln, was the preservation of the Union and democracy. But some very important changes happened in 1862. Early in the year, Lincoln's beloved son, Willie, died. Lincoln wondered what God was trying to say to him through his son's death. And then in September, General Lee invaded Maryland with the intention of capturing Washington, D.C., and perhaps President Lincoln himself. Well, knowing Lee's plan, Lincoln promised God that he would emancipate slaves if God would protect him from Lee's invasion into Maryland. Well, Lee's invasion was blocked at Antietam Creek in Maryland on September 17, 1862. Lincoln felt he had to keep his vow to God, and on the first day of 1863, Lincoln freed Confederate slaves. Later that year, Lincoln had clearly changed his view about the purpose of the war. He made the statement that the United States was founded on the idea that all men are created equal. And he said the reason for the war was to test if that idea could survive. The second main point of the speech was the assertion that the war was God's punishment for slavery. Lincoln stated that since the North held some responsibility for slavery, insofar as they allowed it as part of the constitutional framework, they too had to be punished. The third and the most important point of the speech was that both sides shared the blame for the war, and therefore both sides should share the victory and the redemption at the end of the war. Lincoln called for forgiveness, reconciliation, and no judgments. Lincoln wanted to go easy on the South. Now, other politicians in the North, those known as the radical Republicans, did not agree with Lincoln. They wanted the South to be punished harshly. They wanted convictions. They wanted the South to suffer for what it had done. But Lincoln felt that the radical Republicans were very wrong. And when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln on April 14, he took the best advocate of the South out of the picture. Because at that point, the radical Republicans exerted their authority. Eventually, they impeached Vice President Johnson, and the South would remain under the heavy hand of military governors until the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876. My name is Dr. Rick Gardiner from Columbus State University. This has been another Muskogee County School District podcast. One of the greatest speeches of all time, Lincoln's second inaugural address.